And, the problem with reproduction in animals is that people have a complete misconception about the reproductive cycle in female animals. And this is because most of us have experience of reproduction in the domestic dog, the Kenya day. So we need to look at the fundamental differences between what animals have is an estrous cycle and what the dog has a classic estrous cycle. And of course it's fundamentally different. And it's fundamentally different than the primate menstrual cycle. So the confusion is this, that those of you who've had pet dogs will know that when she's coming into season or into heat season, maybe we'll talk about it, for the first 10 days of the canine reproductive estrous cycle, the bitch will discharge a small quantity of blood from her vagina. This is not the same at all as what happens in the menstrual cycle. In the bitch, what's happening is that the endometrium, the lining of the female reproductive tract, is thickening, it's increasing its blood supply to the epithelium lining the body of the uterus, the horn of the uterus, and that's what's leading to some leakage of blood at that stage. In the menstrual cycle, if fertilization does not occur and the animal will not become pregnant, then the whole lining of the uterus is sloughed off, and that produces the menstrual flow. So the dog confuses people completely, and of course in the bitch, if you have a dog, the time that she's discharging small quantities of blood is the proestrus, is the early stage of estrus. And in animals, it's only when the female is in true estrus, the second stage of the estrus cycle, that she allows the male to mate with her. Although that doesn't mean to say that she won't be interested in seeking the company of males, but she won't allow the male to mate with her. And if you look at the classic pattern of the female reproductive tract in animals, some of you who were at the section where we had a young fox saw this. The classic shape of the female reproductive tract in animals is a bicornic uterus. Two long horns, body of the uterus, the cervix is somewhere here, and the vagina is there. And of course what happens is that when ovulation occurs, the ova are released from the ovaries, left and right, into the oviduct, into the oviducts here. It's actually in the anterior part of the oviducts where fertilization occurs, and then implantation occurs at regular intervals all along the horns of the uterus. So that's the classic female reproductive tract of an animal. And these ones can be very long. I mean, in a sow, for example, in the female pig, if you have to assist, if the animal is giving birth and the contraction is not working properly, and you put your hand in to help her to give birth, you can't possibly reach the end of the horn. It's sort of enormous. Whereas in any other animal, you can put your hand in and you can carry it along the horn. If the animal is big, of course, it's going to form a big, you can't do that. So the primate menstrual cycle is completely different than the animal estrous cycle. And of course, the age at which an animal reaches maturity varies very much. We know a lot about the domestic animal, but horses would be at 18 months of age, for example, and cattle at 6 months of age, and lambs when they're born in the spring would be fertile by autumn. Pigs would be 6 months, and the dog anywhere between 6 and 12 months of age. So it varies when the animal it reaches the stage where it reaches sexual maturity and starts to have one estrous cycle after another. So the estrous cycle is divided into basically 4 phases. Some say 5, but basically there are 4. And the first phase is proestrus. As I've talked about, that's when the bitch discharges a small quantity of blood. But that's under the influence of the hormones, and I'll talk about those in a moment. The reproductive tract is getting ready for fertilization to occur. The females won't normally allow mating during this time, but they will sometimes seek the company of the male. The next stage of the estrous cycle is the period of estrus, and it's during that stage that the male or the female will allow the male to mate with her. Then after the period of estrus, you get the phase of metestrus, which, of course, if the animal is pregnant, the cycle immediately stops under the influence of the hormones. If the animal does not become pregnant, the metestrus, it is the phase when you get the absorption of the thickening of the endometrial lining, which has occurred. You get a bit of, if you take a scraping from the vagina or from the uterus itself, you see a lot of leukocytes begin to appear amongst the cells to knock off any infection or dead tissue and so on. And then the fourth phase of estrus is diestrus, which is a resting phase. You don't get any reproductive changes taking place at all. Now, some animals have one estrus cycle and then they don't have another one. If you take the dog, for example, it tends to have an estrus cycle twice a year, spring and autumn. So the dog will be described as goes through the four phases, and then it's anestrus. In other words, there's no estrus activity at all for months at a time. Other animals would have a number of estrus cycles following another, and they're known as polyestrus animals, so they have one estrus cycle after another. Some of it, sometimes at certain times of the year, but it just depends on what species we're talking about. If you talk about the horses or the cattle, which would be the farmers would maintain or still maintain, in the spring, they would have one estrus cycle after until mating and pregnancy occur, and then the cycle stops. Whereas other animals, when they give birth, don't have another estrus cycle while they're rearing their puppies. I've used puppies, they're young. Bitches, for example, once they have a litter of puppies, because of only 2 estrus cycles a year, do not come into season immediately after they give birth. Many other species come into season immediately after they give birth, so-called the postpartum estrus, where they come into season sometimes within days of giving birth. The horse and the cow will be classic examples of this, where they come into the estrus, and of course mating often occurs. In other animals, like the seal, where you only get the male and the female present, on the beaches where the females give birth, then you get the females coming into season very quickly after they've given their birth, and you get postpartum estrus and postpartum mating. And of course, I'll come back to it in a moment, but sometimes you get delayed in lactation in that the pregnancy doesn't proceed immediately after following mating. But you get polyestrus animals, one estrus cycle after another. And then there are some animals that breed at certain times of the year. They are known as seasonally polyestrus. Daylight length controls this, of course. And of course, the animals that would normally be expected to have their young at the time of the year most favourite to their survival. Depending on the gestation length, this will determine whether they cycle or not. So, if, for example, you have a gestation length for something like 5 months, you will then cycle in the autumn, because the gestation length then will go through the winter, and the infant will be born the following spring. The classic example of this, of course, is the sheep and deer. The deer, the rutting season, the deer is in the autumn. The sheep go into seed, they cycle in the autumn. On the other hand, if the gestation length is 9, 10, or 11 months, as it would be in cattle and horses, then it's the spring, which is when they cycle. They have one estrus cycle after another. And they're known as seasonally polyestrus animals. And if mating doesn't occur, they will cycle until mating does occur, until fertilization occurs. And if you remember, how is this controlled? Well, of course, it's all daylight length. You remember the hypothalamus is what's sensitive to light. The hypothalamus then controls the activity of the pituitary gland. The pituitary gland produces follicle-stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. And in the female, follicle-stimulating hormone does what the name suggests. It stimulates the production of follicles in the ovary. And of course, it's the follicles in the ovary that produce the estrogens. And it's the estrogens circulating in the blood which produce all the signs of estrus. And then ovulation occurs under the influence of luteinizing hormone. The ovary releases a follicle, The follicle is then encapsulated in the fallopian tube and the uterus, and fertilization occurs if the animal has been mated. And the control of this, how is this cyclical activity controlled? Well, it's all controlled by feedback mechanisms. Now, when you talk to the, I'm not a biochemist, when you talk to the biochemist and you ask, how does the feedback mechanism work? I'm never convinced that it's explained to me how it does, but it does work, because it seems that rising FSH levels, follicle-stimulating hormone, here inhibits eventually more follicle-stimulating hormone being produced from the hypothalamus, from the anterior pituitary. The hypophysis and the anterior pituitary are the same thing. And luteinizing hormone also has a feedback mechanism. So they're both, as they rise, it's a negative feedback. They're reducing the amount of hormone that's produced. And it's that swings and roundabouts. As the level increases, so it has a feedback, so the level reduces, so you get this cyclic activity. But it's the daylight length that triggers it. In the short day breeders, it's like, well, the animals that breed in the autumn are known as short day breeders because daylight length is decreasing. The animals that breed in the spring are known as long day breeders because they're daylight length increases. So that's, of course, how the thing is controlled and how it's cyclical in activity. It's negative feedback mechanism. And of course, the estrogens and the progesterone is produced by the corpus luteum, initially anyway. And it's the progesterone also has a feedback which stops the cycling, unless the animal is pregnant. And if the animal is pregnant, then it stops in the luteal phase, in the stage where progesterone quiescence makes the reproductive quiet, and it's the progesterone of the corpus luteum that maintains pregnancy in the early stages. In many animals, as pregnancy progresses, the placenta takes over, producing these vital hormones. So in many animals, the progesterone is produced by the placenta, and that's what maintains pregnancy until the duration of pregnancy is completed. And the other thing to appreciate is that exactly the same hormones are present in the male, because of course it's vitally important that when the female is cycling like this, the male is also cycling, or not cycling but producing viable spermatozoa and viable testosterone, so that mating actually occurs. So again, we have the hypothalamus here working on the anterior pituitary, and the anterior pituitary produces follicle-stimulating hormone. Got a follicle-stimulating hormone that stimulates spermatogenesis in the testes, and it's luteinizing hormone that stimulates the androgen production, the testosterone production, that brings about all the secondary sex characteristics that you expect to see in an active male animal. So exactly the same hormones are involved in the male as involved in the female, and it's all activated by the hypothalamus. Now, some animals, of course, some males are capable of inseminating a female all year round, but some animals that, for example, are short-day breeders, you get an enlargement of the testes, much greater sperm production when the daylight length is decreasing. And the same can be said of the long day breeders. The animals that breed in the spring, you get more activity, more spermatozoa produced when they're about to be, when they have an opportunity to mate with the female. So again, daylight length controls all that. And of course, in animals that are scrotum, where the testes is maintained in the scrotum outside the animal body, it's always said that this is because you need to have a slightly lower temperature for viable spermatozoa to be produced. But the guinea pig, the elephant, and all birds have abdominal testes. I'm not so sure that argument really holds, because it seems to be an evolution free. I don't quite understand how or why it's not present in all animals. So that's the same hormones are present in the male and the female. Of course, they do very different things. It's important to appreciate that the cycle length, the length of the actual estrous cycle, varies quite a bit in particular species. For example, if the domestic animals we know best of all, the cow and the horse, have roughly a 21-day estrous cycle. And proestrus will last for 3 days. The period of estrus in the horse lasts running a stud farm, this means that you have to mate the horse sometime during the period of estrus, which lasts for up to a week. And I did mention to you, did I, before that when you have a very valuable stallion, there's no external signs that the female horse is in estrus. Some animals have very pronounced swelling of the external genitalia. The bitch, for example, and the pig, there's no doubt at all that she's in estrus. You can follow it. But the horse doesn't have any external signs, and the only sign that the animal is in true estrus is that she would, when she stands, the male to mate with her. And that's why in stud farms they don't produce the valuable stallion to test whether the female will allow her to mate with her. They produce an old nag, which they call a teaser. He goes along to the female and see if she'll stand. They don't allow him to mate with her, but if she'll stand and doesn't kick out furiously if the stallion is worth millions of pounds, then they know that the female, and then the stallion is produced and he's allowed to mate with her, because that's a very controlled breeding situation. The cow is fascinating, the Pro-bit, because she doesn't ovulate until 12 to 24 hours after the end of estrus. Now, when Murphy, I always say when Murphy's, if it can happen, it will happen. The one thing that facilitated the development of artificial insemination in cattle was the fact that the cow didn't ovulate right in the middle of estrus, and I'll explain what I mean by that. Artificial insemination was introduced basically to improve the quality of the genetic material that was available to the farming community. So you had bulls in an AI station. You collected semen from the bulls. And strangely, with bull semen, you can dilute it. So you can dilute it 100-fold. So a 5 ml sample of semen can produce many cows. You can dilute it, and you dilute it with egg diluent, with egg. You whip up an egg and you use an egg diluent to dilute it. And then you can freeze that in liquid nitrogen at -70, and you can store it for it seems years, then you can thaw and introduce the thawed semen into the female reproductive tract of the animal. And it facilitates the running of an AI cell. If the estrus period in a cow was very short, it would mean that, and the ovulation was occurring over a very short period of time, it would mean that as soon as you rang the AI man, he'd have to be there within a few hours. It doesn't matter, you can be there the next day or the day after that, because she ovulates after the end of estrus. It's extraordinary that the one animal that they chose to develop artificial insemination in that had this unique estrus cycle. And what's more, it turned out it had an absolutely unique ability to dilute the semen, because most other animals are very difficult to do. At one stage in the zoo, the Wellcome Research Institute in London Zoo was trying to perfect artificial insemination in highly endangered cat species. And after 10 years, it produced one cub from a mountain lion puma. The dilution and the storage of semen in most animals is a nightmare, but in cattle it works perfectly. That's just a freak. Normally when you try to do something like that, it wouldn't work, but it does work. So the duration of estrus that is important, and the length of the cycle is also interesting. Most of it is 21 days. In the bitch, of course, it's a bit longer than that, but the bitch is in season, it is in the period of estrus between the 12th and the 15th day, and that's the time that she will allow the male to mate with her. I always remember the client when I was in practice who had never had a bitch before, and she wanted to have a lovely red setter. She came into season, and we looked at the stud book that Irish Kennel Club, we arranged for a male to mate with her. She was made on the appropriate day, everything was grand. And Rosie came over to her owner, and that was that until I was called as she was giving birth. And I was called to meet her solicitor. Because what happened was, there were 3 lovely red setter puppies, but there were 4 puppies that certainly went red setters. So I'm talking to the lady quiet next door. So when she brought the bitch back from being mated, of course she had to do something out in the garden and so on. So there were more than one father in her litter, and I can remember the solicitor who agreed with me to ear as I explained to the state what had actually happened. More than one father, of course, there were mongrel collies and all sorts of things. And when I suggested we were put the mongrels down, she said, "You want to murder them?" So that's the I left. I decided I'm not doing that. So don't forget, in many animal species, more than 1 million to 1 male occurs, and of course that increases the genetic variation of the developing embryos, and this may be very good for survival in the long term. So animals that are one-estrous cycle are known as monoestrous animals. Animals that are repeated are known as polyestrous animals, and animals that come in at various times of the year are known as seasonally polyestrous. And of course, as I said before, it's lactation period. The lactation period in the pig, dog, and the cat, it will inhibit estrus, even in the pig. But in some other animals, like the cow or horse, it doesn't. You get a postpartum estrus, even though the animal is lactation. Now, there are many factors that affect the estrus cycle, but I mean, those factors are the nutritional state of the animal. If the animal is very poor nutritionally, if it's had a rough time because of the nature of its food is not present, particularly in herbivores, if it's a drought situation, then you get an interruption in the cycle. And of course, one of the other things that we don't see nowadays is animals that have to work very hard. If you horses working very hard, or in some countries even the cattle have to plow and so on, if they're working very hard and not in good bodily position, then you don't get estrus cycles occurring. Of course, light also affects the presence of the cycle or the absence of it, depending on the time of the year. Temperature, very little effect really. Age, yes, age is a factor. In primates, yes, we have chimps in the zoo who go through the menopause, and boy, do they get cross because they're going through the menopause. Another story. When you come up to the zoo next, and if you come back up to the zoo next year, you can see some of the chimps that are holding cross. Although Judy, the animal who hates me with a passion, has gone and please say to us who else where they don't survive. But they do get cross. But temperature is not an effect. Age certainly is. And most animals stop cycling reproductively as they get older, particularly primates. But some of the older non-primates will continue to cycle right to almost to their last days. Although very seldom the fertility rate will go down. And you do get endocrine disturbances. You do get cystic ovaries, which occurs in some females, particularly in cattle. And the cattle marks of Ireland are well familiar with the mad heifer, the heifer that goes in. She's stuck in estrus, she's cystic ovaries, and she just won't be confined. You can't manage her at all, and she goes absolutely wild. And she shot one mad heifer in the feeding park on one occasion, and I shot another one in my days of practice in the main street in Ross after it damaged 10 cars and whatever was on. So mad heifers are quite unlucky. But that's all to do with cystic ovaries. Now the gestation length, of course, varies considerably. And of course, one of the fascinating things about gestation length is that it's not apparent that it's related to body weight. I mean, okay, the hamster has a gestation length of 20 days, very short, the mouse and the rat 21 days. That shows how rapidly populations can increase because they have a postpartum estrus, they can mate again. So every 21 days, the youngsters can be weaned about 16 days. You can get a litter of rats every 21 days, and the same with mice. So that's very fast. Guinea pigs, well, they have a longer gestation length, although they're not that much bigger than an adult rat. But the reason for that is that they don't burrow very well. The youngsters that are born are fully furred, eyes open, ready to run around because they're born on a grassland, in a grass situation. Whereas the rat and the mouse and the hamster, of course, are born naked and lying in the nest produced by the mother. The dog has a gestation length of 62 days, that's sort of all the failure age you can see. The fox, slightly short, 52 days, why that is, haven't only knows. Deer, 205 days. They're often they're short day breeders, they come in size in the autumn. And many of you have heard the red deer calling on a Russian stand in the British Americans. What a magic sound. Nobody's scared. Some of the zoologists, I always wonder, people talk about going to Africa, the Serengeti, to look at the wildebeest. Why don't you go and look at what's happening around you? certainly the magical call of the still morning mixed with the red you're on the looking sound is eerie sound. Anyway, that's the orphan breeders. And then if you look at some of the other animals on the other side, the mink, the pig, which 150 days, the sheep mating in the autumn, the goat the same, the cow 280 days, so it mates in the spring, late in the spring, so normally the calf is born the following spring, when again there's plenty of grass, normally in the wild situation. The horse would come into season a bit earlier. And one of the strange things about a horse is that if it's a thoroughbred horse, as far as the aging of the animal is concerned, it's 1 year old on the 1st of January in the year after it's born. So the earlier you can get the horse to produce a youngster, the more mature the animal will be the following January. And of course, as far as racing is concerned, the more mature the animal is, the better it has a chance of doing well in the race for 1 year old, 2 year old, and so on. So you're always trying to get the horse, the female, the male, to come into season early in the development cycle. And that can be achieved. It's daylight, remember, that controls it. So what you hear the horse people, you put the mare under lights. What's that mean? It means that in January, you bring the mare in to a loose box and you alter the photo period. In other words, you have lights on in her loose box. And this simulates the fact that spring is coming. So you're trying to induce her to cycle earlier so she can be mated earlier. So that when the foal is born, she's born more mature when she gets to the age when she's going to race. And that's a trick that's used in a number of other species. And again, the famous old elephant. There are 4 elephants in the zoo pregnant at the moment, which is great news. How do we diagnose pregnancy in an elephant? Well, it's the biochemist has got going, and you pick up a fecal sample, and you can measure the progesterone levels. In my day, when we were trying to do it in many animals, we would take a blood sample. Well, you'll get a blood sample from an elephant was quite a trick because you've got to use the ear, you've got to warm the ear with a hair dryer, and of course the elephant doesn't mind that if you stick a needle in its vein. You get away with it once or twice, but then it gets very difficult. You end up chaining up the animal. That doesn't work at all. It's so easy to pick up fecal material, and it's the same in the rhino and hippo. And of course, if you have animals running together, you simply feed them different coloured beads. So you know that animal gets, if you do digestible, they pass out in the feces. So as long as the keeper doesn't get his records mixed up, you pick up a fecal sample with red beads, you know it's from baby and so on. And that's how you actually identify the animal. And we know that the biochemists diagnose pregnancy, not such. Of course, the other method of diagnosing pregnancy is in farm animals. Is simply, we used to have to handle the larger animals, the vets would handle the reproductive fat tract of the female by putting the vet put his hand to the rectum of the animal. And if you remember your anatomy, the female reproductive lies below that. And you can palpate the female with the uterus, and you can find the ovary, you can find the uterus, particularly in cattle, you get a classic feeling of the placenta being developed, and you can diagnose pregnancy in that way. Nowadays, it's all ultrasound. You get one of the ultrasound, you get a scan of the animal's abdomen, particularly in sheep, and you can see them developing embryos. And the farmers always want to know whether the sheep is carrying twins or singles or triplets or whatever, so they can actually determine how many youngsters they're going to have, because that can very often determine the economics of the whole sheep breeding program. And let me just show you an example of the reproductive cycle hormones of sheep, because in order to make sure that you farm more efficiently and you don't have all your that sheep lying at different times of the night. Sheep always like to give birth in the dark in a corner of the field, usually Nash and Lane, full of the farmers trying to find out what's going on. And very often, because they're having not just single youngsters but twins or triplets, they sometimes need assistance with birth. And therefore, how can you control this? Well, again, it's understanding the hormones of the reproductive cycle. Because as you can see here, you get a terrific, this progesterone keeps the whole reproductive tract quiet. And as soon as you remove progesterone, the progesterone level falls, you get a big peak of estrus, and ovulation occurs shortly afterwards. So what you do with the sheep is you put a tampon into the vagina of the sheep that has a lot of progesterone, and the progesterone is slowly absorbed, and this stops the estrus cycle. So if you have 10 or 12 sheep, that you want to batch mate them and batch lamb them. You simply introduce tampons into the vagina of the sheep, and then the reproductive cycle stops. You're doing this, of course, in the autumn, because they're short-lived breeders. And then, on a particular day, you remove the tampons from all the sheep, from the 10 or 12 sheep, and you know that within 24 hours, those sheep will ovulate and will allow the male, the ram, to mate. So you can batch mate. If the ram wears a ram, a colour harness on his chest, you can make sure that she's actually, you can see where you've mated with her, you will leave some of the signs on the sheep. So you can batch mate your lambs. And then you know when lambing season comes, if you keep your records correctly, you can then lamb them indoors. If you have a week or so between your batches, you can bring those lambs indoors to a nice warm shed. You have a light, you have a nice straw bed, and they the sheep then. You keep an eye on them in comfort. You get a much higher percentage of live viable lambs, and of course predation is not a problem. There's so much easier to manage. And all that happens because you can control the reproductive cycle in that way. And it's an example of one of the ways that you can manipulate the reproductive cycle to your advantage. It's the really only animal where that works effectively. It now works very well, and particularly with pedigree sheep where you have building them. If you're hill farming, of course, it's different. But with pedigree breeds and lowland breeds, where you're intensively managing on the farm, it makes for a much better survival on land and so on, if you can manage it indoors under daylight and not running around a field at night. Now there's another very interesting phenomenon that occurs, and it's called diapods. And this is where you get mating occurring, fertilization occurring, and then for some reason the development does not take place. Now many animals show diapods. One of the fascinating things that's come out from our understanding of badger reproduction, following on the culling of badgers both in Ireland and the UK, is to understand the reproductive cycle of the female badger. Because for some reason, the female badger mates with the male. They live, as you know, in a set. There are males and females present in the set. So there's always male and female present. But for some reason, the female badger comes into season as daylight getting increases. Mating occurs in April, May, but development doesn't start. There's a resting phase, diapods. The embryos don't implant when they may start to implant, they rest in the anterior part of the female. And it's not till the autumn, till December, January, that they start to develop, and they're born in February, March. That's why the cull, incidentally, in the UK, or when the battle is in cull, why the cull is always in the autumn, because then you're not culling a female that has dependent interest in the den. You're culling her when she's past the relationship. I don't want to get into all the controversy about that. But that's the other diapause. Other animals have a diapause for different reasons. If you have sea lions, the males and females are only present together on the beach where the female gives birth to her pups. And it's in that situation where the male mates with her. And then no development takes place at all for many months. The sea lions in Dublin Zoo, for example, always give birth about Midsummer's Day. And then they mate within 24 to 48 hours after that. And then no development takes place at all until a very short gestation length, 3 or 4 months, and they give birth again the following Midsummer's Day. And you can understand why mating has to occur in the wild, certainly, not after the zoo situation, but in the wild where cultivating people are only present. So what is the advantage of diapods? Heaven only knows. But there is another extraordinary example, and that is in the kangaroo. Again, we know so much about kangaroos because they tend to be culled, they tend to reach test proportions. And provided intelligent use is made of the carcasses, you can learn an awful lot about the reproduction of the kangaroo. But the kangaroo has again an ovaries uterus. Mating occurs during the period of estrus. Fertilization occurs, and a very small joey is born after a very short gestation length, and it makes its way onto a teat or a nipple in the pouch. And as soon as birth takes place, the animal immediately mates again, and another joey is produced. But that joey does not develop, goes into diapause. And that youngster in the female reproductive tract of the kangaroo remains in diapause until the joey that's on the teat it matures and stops suckling. And once that happens, then you get development proceeding, implantation occurring, development proceeding, and so on. But the interesting thing about the kangaroo is, of course, that you can get an older kangaroo that leaves the pouch and it sucks on. There's two teats in the pouch of the kangaroo. It's like an external uterus almost. I mean, the youngsters are tiny. And the youngster, the older kangaroo, still will put its nose into its mother's pouch and will suckle from the teat in which it attached itself to its two teats. And it will do that while there's another joey who's being reared on the teat, on the other teat. They don't swap teats once they attach to the teat. It's like, did you know when a pig has 17 babies? They all have their own mammary gland which they stick to, and they don't go to another mammary gland. So if a sow has 17 youngsters and not 17 active mammary glands, you have one problem of maybe two young babies that are going to get very cross. How do you detect them? They're screaming like hell because they're hungry. And a good pig husbandry man will sort that out by moving the pigs around. But in this situation, there's only two, and the diapause, the presence of the joey, inhibits the development. You get diapause. But the other fascinating thing, and this is not as well, this happens at all, you get different quality of milk being produced in each teat. Because the joey on the teat that's very small needs high protein, low fat milk. Whereas the young kangaroo that's drinking from the other teat drinks low protein, high fat. So it's different concept of different types of milk. Now how mammary glands is the only animal that this happens in. Most animals that have 2 or 4 or maybe 8 or 10 mammary glands, the analysis of the milk will show you that the milk is identical in all mammary glands. But in the kangaroo, it's not identical. And I don't know how on earth, I mean, it's prolactin is what stimulates production of milk. It's the removal of milk from a mammary gland that helps to produce milk, continued production of milk. But how the milk is varied in its concentration, that's not understood at all. But obviously it's all over. But it certainly can be proven on many occasions that it is different in its concentration. So that's another area. So what is the advantage of diapause? Heaven only knows what the advantage of diapause is in many animals. And of course, it's don't forget that the hormones from the pituitary to the back of the division, the hormones from the hypothalamus that control the pituitary, there's a lot of them, but the ones that we're interested in are follicle-stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. And again, it's a feedback mechanism. Some of the hormones from that pituitary have both stimulating and inhibiting releasing factors, but the follicle-stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone are controlled by negative feedback. Positive feedback produces more, negative feedback produces less. Now the other thing that happens, of course, I will try and get into this the next time we start, the type of placenta is produced. Because the connection, developing embryo depends on the placenta attachment. This is distinct from, I once asked a group of students, what's the difference between an egg and an animal developing in utero? And of course, once the egg is laid, it has to have everything in it for the chick to develop to the hatching period, either 20 days or 45 days, whatever it is. Whereas the placenta mammal gets everything it wants from its mother through via the placenta. So the egg is a unique organ structure which provides all the nutrition that the developing embryo wants. And of course, don't forget, the main advantage of birds is they don't produce urea, it's uric acid which is insoluble, and therefore that builds up in the egg. It doesn't actually, it's not toxic as far as the developing embryo, the developing chick is concerned, whereas if it was urea, it would be highly toxic. Forget camels, they're an exception when you get a high level of urea, but most animals, urea is highly toxic. So the egg is able to develop, the embryo the egg is able to develop for 45 days without any problem in swarm and so on. Okay, I've thrown an awful lot of things at you this morning. Read about it